Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of You Are My Borough with myself, Scott Wilson, and Dom Shaw from the Northern Echo. We are going to be looking ahead to the visit of Ipswich Town to the Riverside this weekend. We'll have a bit of a chat on how Borough might be lining up in the wake of Michael Carrick's press conference yesterday. We'll have a bit of a talk about what Borough can expect from an Ipswich side who have certainly been flying in the early weeks of this season. And then we'll maybe have a little bit of a prediction about how things might go. You well, Dom?
I am. Yourself?
Yeah, all good, thank you. All good. Couple of quick bits. If you're watching this on YouTube, then please like, subscribe, and leave any comments. We do read them. We certainly do take them on board. And if you're listening on one of the various podcast platforms, then rate and review, because it does help us in terms of the mystical algorithms and all this kind of carry on. Right, Dom, Ipswich. So you were at Michael Carrick's press conference yesterday. We speculated earlier in the week about whether he would be given much away on the injury front, with Borough obviously having multiple issues ahead of this Ipswich game. I think we probably guessed that he wouldn't be saying an awful lot definitively. And I think if we'd put a lot of money on that, our money would be safe, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Very little to report, really, in terms of injuries, which, and we'll get into this, I completely understand, because Carrick talked a lot yesterday about the term, he was talking about Carrick McKenna at, obviously, Ipswich head coach, who he worked closely with at Manchester United, and he talked about how they basically know each other inside out. So it's already going to be difficult. And we talked to Carrick about this. You know, how do you prepare to face a manager who knows you probably as well as you know yourself from a football perspective? So with that in mind, I guess anything you can keep up your sleeve, then you're going to, aren't you? That said, and like clearly come 2:00 tomorrow, I might be way off with this. My instinct told me that probably not to expect anyone back. Yeah. But I say that with no conviction. It's clearly just trying to read a poker face. What the one specific he did get into was Paddy McNair, who obviously went off at Leeds last week, and he said that he had a back spasm that's taken a while to settle down. He didn't get into the specifics on the others. We clearly know the long termers are going to be out.
Yeah,
McGree and Force. I mean, 99.9%
feels unlikely, doesn't it?
If either of those would appear on the bench. I guess the ones that you'd be hoping for are Fry and Hackney, and he wasn't giving anything away on that. So that's the guessing game come 2:00 tomorrow. But as of now, our predicted team from our pod and vid on Wednesday, I think, still stands.
Yeah, which is if by magic is now running along. So we kind of had a guess at Howson going into back four, Vandenberg moving across the centre half alongside Clark, and Gell obviously at left back, which would probably mean Barlaser and Crooks in centre mid, Silvera, Rodgers and Greenwood, although there is the wild card of playing Bangura in a higher position up that left-hand side, and probably Latterlath getting the nod ahead of Coburn. I mean, to a certain degree, it feels like a bit of a cobbled together side, but you wouldn't say it was a weak side, would you?
No, I mean, Johnny Howson has demonstrated that he's, if Borough had to play this team, Howson has shown that he's more than capable of playing at right back or at centre half, to be fair, when he had to do a job there. Matt Crooks played the vast majority of his football in more of an orthodox midfield role up until Carrick's appointment. And Silvera coming in. Well, if we go back to the early weeks of the season, Silvera, in flashes, I actually thought looked the most exciting of all the signings. Now, Greenwood and Rodgers have clearly established themselves and found their feet since, and Engel has done the same, and Barlaser's, and Bangura, when he's played, has been solid enough. But, it's still a team of senior players. You're not having to rope it. Finn Cartwright, while undoubtedly is a huge talent, is a 16-year-old kid. What you don't want to do is be rushed into playing players maybe ahead of the time. We might be surprised, mightn't we? Come to it on Saturday afternoon. We might be surprised. But there was nothing definitive either way, which, as you say, we couldn't expect. Really. Interestingly, just to move it on slightly, we and you can read this online and in the paper today if you haven't already, but we asked Carrick about January and has these last few weeks and the crisis really of injuries and availability or unavailability altered Borough's thinking for January. And within his answer to that, he probably gave away more on injuries and transfers, because he said, well, no, because we don't want to panic and change our plans, but also come January, we're hoping to have some of those players back. So you'd look and hope that Fry and Hackney, McNair, and possibly McGree and Force as well. And suddenly then the complexion changes, doesn't it, entirely?
Yeah, well, that's it, isn't it? That's always the debate with making signings on the back of injuries, is that if and when they come back, all of a sudden you've got a much bigger, much more bloated squad with kind of selection issues, a whole different range of them then. So, so did you, is your main takeaway from that then? Yes, the injuries, hopefully some of them back. But in terms of transfers then, that actually we're still probably where we were a month, 2 months ago, which was, the gut feeling was a striker, maybe a centre-half.
Yeah, I think it'll be a defender, which I know kind of maybe opens myself up to say, well, that surely they are responding there to the injury crisis and the
but Lenihan's a different one, isn't he? Because
exactly, Lenihan's a different one because and Smith are both end of the season, and B, there's the McNair uncertainty that we've talked about at length, and a senior player who's approaching the end of his contract. So I think even without the Lenihan and Smith injuries, that's an area that Borough have been looking at in January to potentially safeguard themselves. The only slight difference is, whereas previously they might have been looking at January as an opportunity to bring someone in with perhaps next season in mind.
Yeah.
Guess now there's the possibility that someone's going to have to come in and hit the ground running slightly.
I think certainly if McNair was to leave.
Yeah, but then if McNair stays, you've still got Fry, McNair, Clark back fit as well now, and Vandenberg, who's obviously, I was going to say deputised at centre-half, but he hasn't, because that's his best position. He's deputised at right back and clearly shown what he can do at centre-half as well. So, it'll be interesting to see how he plays out over the next few weeks, I think, injuries and availability wise.
You touched on the kind of Kieran McKenna dynamic there. I mean, just how close were him and Carrick? Did Carrick give the impression? And, it's early days for both of them, but their careers seem to be following fairly similar trajectories. And already they're both being kind of touted for potential Premier League jobs, maybe not that much further down the line.
Well, what I didn't know is they actually played together at Spurs.
I didn't know that either.
McKenna, well, I said played together. I think McKenna was in the reserves as it had been then. And reading some of his quotes from his press conference, which I think was yesterday, he was saying how when Carrick was injured, he came down to play with the reserves or the younger lads. So they kind of came across each other then.
Yeah.
But it was at Man United when Carrick was coming to the back end of his playing career. McKenna was working with the youth age groups at United. And Carrick said yesterday, in his words, that he's one of the best coaches he's ever come across. And McKenna then obviously went up to become part of the first team setup under Mourinho and Solskjaer. And obviously they worked together then. McKenna took the Ipswich job 2 years ago and spoke to Carrick before taking that job. And then obviously Carrick came in at Borough a year ago. I think a couple of points. If Carrick gave McKenna the green light and told him to go for it, then Ipswich fans should be eternally grateful because the job is done there. And the other thing, it looks to me like there's going to be some Premier League vacancies in the next few weeks, doesn't it? Or there's certainly Cooper at Forest, maybe
Hodgson Palace, yeah.
And you'd look, whereas we were having this conversation, weren't we, at the back end of last season, if any Premier League jobs come up, Michael Carrick's inevitably going to be linked. I think that's probably the same again. I know Palace were loosely linked at the end of last season, weren't they? But you would think McKenna is certainly going to be in the conversation. Now, that's not for 1 minute to say go. I think he's on a good thing at Ipswich, but I think the question's certainly going to be asked, isn't it? I'd be amazed if the question wasn't asked before the end of the season.
Well, it's one of those where if Roy Hodgson was to leave Palace tomorrow, Michael Carrick and Carrick McKenna would immediately be installed in the top 10 in the betting, probably
inevitably.
top 5.
Yeah.
You know, if nothing else, there'll be that kind of noise around them, won't there? Because, like you say, McKenna's just been on a remarkable upward trajectory with Ipswich, and obviously the way they've hit the ground running, which we'll get to in a second, in the Championship's been fantastic. And obviously what happened at the start of this season, you know, in a strange kind of way, is an extra feather in Carrick's cap, if you like, because he has now shown that he can get a club out of a bit of a rut when things aren't going quite so well, which, you know, which I think Premier League clubs will look at and see it as a major positive, the fact that he turned things around when they were so sticky at the start of the season, rather than worry about what was going wrong in those early days. So Ipswich then.
I just think, sorry, just to put in quickly on that, I think the other thing with both of them is we talk about, understandably, about parachute payments and the huge advantage now clubs coming down from the Premier League have. And clearly Ipswich have significant backing. I know there was a lot of talk about when they signed Nathan Broadhead in January, for example, who was wanted by Championship clubs at the time, and yet Ipswich paid what Championship clubs couldn't afford. I remember Sunderland being in for him at the time, weren't they, in the January window?
Yeah.
But then it obviously took them up, but then they've continued the trajectory this season, and they're now wedged between Leicester and the other teams who came down, which is testament really to the job he's done. And the same can be said of Carrick, can't it? Obviously the ride he took Borough on last season and this season, establishing themselves. Because even if Borough had an average start to the season, they'd have been firmly entrenched in the top 6 now, wouldn't they? It's only because they were playing catch up again, really, after the 7-game winless start. And clearly there was mitigating factors there. So I think that's another big string to both of the bow, isn't it?
So Ipswich, as you said there, a point off top. They're actually 7 points clear of Leeds in 3rd position, so they still have a pretty healthy gap. I watched them on the opening day of the season when they won at Sunderland 2-1, and they were really good. You know, really fluid in attack, really well drilled, really well organised, and they've not really stopped from there. I guess the only thing you would say is their only away defeat of the season came last time out in terms of their last away game at West Brom. And their 2 away games before that were 2-2 draws at Rotherham and Birmingham. So they haven't actually won in their last 3 away games. Is there a bit of a glimmer of light for Borough there?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think like clearly their away record is very good. They're the second or third. I think they've got the second or third best away record in the league. But I think they've won 9 from 10 at home. It's that Portman Road looks and was their only defeat off the top of my head to Leeds when they should have won? Was it a bit of a skelter mad second half? Yeah. So clearly that Portman Road form is going to be the thing that drives them on. And we were talking about this earlier in the week, weren't they? They look nailed on for at least the top 6, don't they, at this stage? Because even if their away form becomes slightly indifferent, as it has done in the last few weeks, if they continue with anything like their current home form, then they're just going to keep picking up points every other week. But I do think there's clearly a slight, you know, to be winless in 3, and those last 3 away games, you know, Rotherham, you'd have expected them to win there. Birmingham, you'd have expected them to win there, and I think they equalised late at Birmingham, if I remember rightly. In fact, they might have been 2-0 down at half time, and they came back to get a point there. So that's clearly the chink. And the other thing is, as we've talked about at length, Borough have fared so well against the top teams, especially at home.
I mean, that front 3 of Ipswich, Chaplin, Hurst, Broadhead, is right up there with anything in the league, isn't it? And that for me would give me a real optimism if I was an Ipswich fan that they will hang around there, because all 3 are capable of scoring goals. And even if one of them was to get a bit of a bad injury, you'd still back the other two to fill the gap and score goals. And, they're not hugely reliant on one forward, are they? Which can sometimes be a bit of a red flag against the team who are up there that, okay, well, what happens if something happens to that one player? Ipswich aren't like that. And that front three is just about as good as anything in the league.
And you've got to think there with, poor Matt Clark, because he hasn't played for, well, he played 5 minutes in 14 months. Then he's thrust straight back into action from the bench against that Leeds front four. And, Somerville last week, he's as good as anything in the Championship, isn't he? Dan James on the other side was playing for Man United a few weeks ago. How much did they spend on Rutter? Pirro was in demand for years. So Clark's thrust straight into that. And then if he starts on Saturday, which looks likely, well, he's bound to, isn't he? If McNair and Fry don't make it, then he's up against that Ipswich front line. It's going to be a test for a makeshift Borough defence, isn't it? And then it goes back to, again, something we were talking about earlier this week, this differential between Borough's defensive record at home and away. But Borough have been rock solid at home, haven't they? Which makes the leakiness away from home all the more surprising, really.
I mean, we're talking if some buts here, because, as we said, we don't know if anyone is going to come back. But if Johnny Howson was to have to go into the back four, would there be any worry about a Howsonless midfield against that front three? Because certainly in that Sunderland game that I watched, what was really noticeable about that front three for Ipswich is they all basically play anywhere. They will drop out, they'll pull wide, one will play as a 10, then all of a sudden they'll switch. And Barlaser and Crooks, if it is to be that kind of defensive midfield unit, they're going to have their wits about them. Yeah,
because without going overboard on Sunderland again, because I know we talked a fair bit about them in the midweek pod, obviously in the aftermath of Mowbray's sacking. But one of Sunderland's problems really is maybe a lack of defensive shield in that midfield. Yeah. Dan Neil likes to go forward, doesn't he? Pierre Ekwa has had a bit of an indifferent start to the season after a really good end to last season. And I think Ipswich took advantage of that at the stage of light on the opening weekend. And in the comments to our vid, earlier this week, a fair few of the fans were saying that they think the defensive issues is actually got a lot to do with the Borough midfield and maybe a lack of protection from the Borough midfield. Now, if you're taking Howson out of that, then I think that is a slight concern.
If we're talking centre midfield, Sam Morsey, Massimo Luongo.
Well, Luongo's out.
Is he?
Luongo's out, which is a shame, because that would have been a reunion of all reunions.
Someone's on the ball. Did you remotely see that, though, as a centre mid that would be up there challenging for promotion? I mean, let's be honest, we saw very, very, very little of Luongo as a Borough player. We saw a little bit more of Morsey. You wouldn't really have had either of them as a top two Championship midfield, would you?
Well, I know when Morsey went to Ipswich, I remember thinking at the time, you're a Championship player. You shouldn't,
what you're doing down there,
to go to League One. But that's been a great move for him, hasn't it? He captained Wigan, obviously, and so Morsey less of a surprise. Although clearly I wouldn't have predicted it, but Morsey less of a surprise. Luongo, I mean, that's quite staggering, really, isn't it? Couldn't get a kick, and rightly so, really. But it's not one of them where there's always a player, isn't there, whose stock rises every week that he's not playing. Every club's always got a player who there's always a clamour to get him in. There was none of that with Luongo. I don't think you could go out and find a Borough fan on the street now who'd say, the problem last season was we didn't sign Massimo Luongo after his trial early in the season. Fair play to him, and fair play to McKenna, because how often did we say about Carrick last year? Like, Christ, you've got a player out of Tuba that none of us knew were in there. McKenna's clearly doing the same with those players.
So what's
Luongo's definitely in that category of who was the loan set? Harold McCoody. Remember? He's definitely in the oh Christ, remember him? Category,
well, it felt like he would be one of those players that you'd kind of his name would crop up in 5, 6, 7 years' time.
Where's he now?
Like,
What happened to him?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can't remember him playing for Borough, but I can't even really remember him being a player after that. You know what I mean? And yet that's clearly not been the case.
No.
So what's your thoughts? What's your gut feel?
I think Borough will get something. Just on the back of those, so good against Southampton, so good against Leicester in a different kind of way. Like, clearly there was issues at Leeds last week, but those defensive issues aside, Borough were a real threat going forward. And I know Jones is missing, but you've still got the bulk of that forward line, and they are more stable at home. I don't necessarily think Borough will win, but I don't think they'll lose. I think a score draw. I think maybe 1-1.
I feel like we're kind of very, very reluctant on this vid to say that Borough are going to get beat. I
don't know whether we ever have.
No, well, okay. So here we go. If it's the Borough team with so many changes and so many kind of unknowns about how players are actually going to manage where they're playing and how they're going to link up with those around them, I think Ipswich are strong enough and good enough that they will potentially take advantage of that. Now, if there's even just one back, would make a massive difference, because my big worry is Howson not being in that midfield and Borough just not being able to deal with Ipswich's runners. And
so if Fry can play, you can have Vandenberg.
That's my worry. If Fry plays, then A, the centre half position strengthens straight away. B, Vandenberg goes to fullback. C, Howson is then there in midfield. And I think already that's a completely different proposition. So if Borough have someone back and can stick with the structure that they've been playing with for pretty much most of the season, then I'm with you. I think probably a score draw. If it's the team that we've been running along the bottom, I would probably go 2-1, 3-1 Ipswich. With the caveat that I hope I'm wrong. But I have now made pod video history by being the first one to say, maybe this is the weekend when Borough won't.
If Borough win 2 or 3-1 tomorrow, we can just rewrite history and go back into this vid and chop out the last.
We'll just change it. Yeah, we'll just change it. Yeah. I'll
if that
next to it when I say, but then again,
yeah, like one of those ITV dramas where they film 3 or 4 different.
Yeah, exactly. That's
just
exactly
adapted to suit.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
If that probable team that we've been running across the bottom all week is right, then I was going to say we might need a pat on the back, but then I'm thinking, well, actually, what other options does Carrick actually have? But I did say to him yesterday, you know, when you know someone as well as you and Kieran McKenna know each other, is there a temptation to try and wrong foot him, to try and kind of spring a surprise and catch him off guard? And he kind of smiled and said, "Of course." So if Latte laughs at right back tomorrow, then you know why.
Then you know why. I mean, we will wrap up in a second, but I mean, the one thing we haven't really discussed in all this is the spring the surprise would be a change in formation.
Yeah.
You could go 3 at the back. You could play wing backs. You could go much more of a 4-4-2 if you wanted to, and play Latterlad and Coburn and try and bulk things, you know,
on the left.
Kind of 2 banks of 4. Yeah. I mean, I don't see it though. I don't. There's been no indication throughout Carrick's reign that he's really got that in his mind at any stage, is there?
Well, we said on a number of occasions, didn't we, at the start of the season, if that was going to be the case, he'd have done it. He'd have done it in those early weeks.
Yeah, you would have thought so, wouldn't you?
When Borough were thrashing around for ideas, really, or it looked that way and struggling. So.
Yeah,
it'd be a surprise, but never say never.
Well, that's it. You don't know, but yeah, I think it would be a surprise. But anyway, let's hope that Borough do have players back. Let's hope that we're talking about a win. We will be back next week. It's obviously another really busy week, midweek action again. The games just roll on and on and on. So
talk of the return of former cult heroes. We had Massimo Luongo. Next week it's Aaron Conley.
They're all coming out of the woodwork.
That video might do the rounds again. I suspect
it will. We all know what you're talking about there. Yeah. We will be back with a much more wholesome video at the start of next week, where we'll be reflecting on whatever happens against Ipswich, and yeah, we'll be looking ahead to Borough's midweek action. As I say, the games just keep on coming. So, thanks for watching us. Hope you have a good weekend. Up the Borough, and we will see you next week for another edition of You Are My Borough.